From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I think the American founders would look at it and say, okay, why is the country still in NATO? Why does NATO even exist, right? They were very skeptical of permanent alliances and skeptical of any kind of alliance, and said, look, there will come times when the country will need to engage in alliances, but it should do so very cautiously. It should, the stakes need to be very high, the issues need to be thought through carefully, and the United States needs to make sure to time limit these things for the purpose at hand.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Michael Anton, lecturer in politics and research fellow at Hillsdale's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., and your teacher for the brand new Hillsdale online course, American Foreign Policy. We talked in depth with Michael about that course today. Michael Anton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to talk a bit along the way about some of the big moments covered in the course, but as we begin, give people an overview of this American Foreign Policy course. What do you hope that people take away from what you're teaching them?
Mostly, I want to restore an understanding, or help restore, and I should say that, the course is really based on the scholarship of others. It's very derivative in that sense. I don't mean to be, to sell myself short as a teacher. I may be pretty good at explaining it, but without other people having done all this pioneering work, I would have nothing to talk about, including our own Hillsdale professor, Tom West. Mm-hmm. It's to try to restore the founders' understanding of what America's role in the world should be. And I think Americans got used to America playing an active role because of the events of the 20th century, in particular America's involvement in 2 world wars and leadership role in the Cold War. And I think people think that that's the natural or expected role that America is supposed to play in the world and forever. And that's not the way the founders saw it. They really thought that America should mind its own business, should take advantage of a, if not unique, certainly a very advantageous situation of being so far away from other great powers and really far removed, if it chose to remain so, from great power conflict. And I think one of the things that's happening now is foreign policy has become amazingly controversial again after a period of 2 or 3 generations where there was, I don't want to oversell the idea of a consensus, because certainly there were ups and downs and disagreements and some bitter fights throughout the second half of the 20th century and so on. But what's happening now is this old argument about what America's role in the world should be has come back to the fore. And I think, many people, let's say, associated with President Trump or who sympathized with his policies and rhetoric, think that America, having done so much for so long, needs to go back to an older orientation and do less in the world and sort of look after itself. And there's a lot of bitter opposition to that, and people calling that view illegitimate somehow. And I think that those people in the latter camp who think that America, having assumed a leadership position, must maintain it forever, either are arguing in bad faith, or they just don't really understand or remember the original conception of American foreign policy and the original practice for at least a century, where America pretty much did mind its own business and not intervene in the affairs of the rest of the world.
Talk a bit soon about some of those turning points in foreign policy along the way, but project for me a little bit here, Michael. If the founders saw what foreign policy in America was like today, what would they say to modern American leaders?
I think they would think we were over-involved. I mean, just to take one point, this is a very heretical thing I'm about to say, and hopefully I won't get in too much trouble, but I think the American founders would look at it and say, okay, why is the country still in NATO? Why does NATO even exist, right? They were very skeptical of permanent alliances. Actually, I would say they were just simply opposed to permanent alliances and skeptical of any kind of alliance, and said, look, there will come times when the country will need to engage in alliances, but it should do so very cautiously. It should, the stakes need to be very high. The issues need to be thought through carefully, and the United States needs to make sure to time limit these things for the purpose at hand. So the idea of NATO would have been initially, I think, whether the founders would have supported NATO in the beginning or not is sort of an open question. I think you can make a case for it that they would have thought, okay, well, this is an extraordinary emergency and urgency, and we have to do this, however reluctant we might be. But once it accomplished what it set out to do, that is to say, defeat the Soviet Union and win the Cold War, the idea that the alliance would go on forever and America would stay in it forever, I think would be incomprehensible to the founders. And I don't even think that's a particularly tough call. I think they would look at that and say, what are you doing? This thing should have been shut down. And even if it wasn't to be shut down, America should have withdrawn from it.
There are 9 courses in this American Foreign Policy online course at online.hillsdale.edu. You begin by saying for the early parts of the Republic, for the most part, leaders remained faithful to the founding principles of foreign policy. And there's a break point, the Spanish-American War. How does it fundamentally change the nature of American foreign policy?
I mean, in a number of ways, there are other points at which America, deviated from its core principles of foreign policy before this. But those were usually, they were aberrations, they were short-lived, they were understood to be deviations, or they had some larger purpose, or even some domestic purpose. The Spanish-American War is really the first time when America consciously decides it's a pure war of choice. I mean, the country is not existentially or even materially threatened by Spain. Yes, there was the explosion in the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, which, by the way, forensic studies, over the decades have concluded, decisively. I don't know that we'll ever know for sure, but they think it was, in fact, an accident, a boiler explosion, and not an act of war. In any event, this was a case where, the United States was not existentially threatened or even really materially threatened, and also got involved in a war as a result of this war became for the first time a colonial power where it's administering territories and peoples who are foreign to the United States ostensibly to improve their government. And that was the kind of, however well-intentioned intervention that the founders thought was none of our business and we should not engage in. And it began, many decades of these types of interventions around the world, and in a way that's still with us.
If that is a point in which American foreign policy changes, you say that by the end of World War II, it is American public opinion that perhaps have changed, or at least has accepted the interventionist policies. Why, at that point, does the public begin to change its mind?
Well, some of it's simply a rally around the flag effect. If you go back, and I have done this. I didn't do the actual research, but I read the research of some others who they just went and they found the records of every Gallup poll that was taken on the question of getting involved in World War II from let's say the second half of the 30s up through 1940-41, and American public opinion was opposed, consistently opposed. Sometimes strongly, sometimes a little more narrowly, but always above 50%, saying we don't. However bad this is, we don't think that we have a role to play in it. And that obviously changed dramatically after Pearl Harbor. But interestingly, it changed in a certain way. That is to say, American public opinion wanted to, for obvious reasons, prioritize the war in the Pacific over the war in Europe. And all of the elites in Washington and the Roosevelt administration and in the military saw Hitler as a greater threat and wanted to prioritize the war in the European theater. By the end of the war, essentially, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, the old Republican Party, the Robert Taft Republican Party, I hesitate to use the term isolationist because it's become like a swear word, almost an insult, but the non-interventionist, the restrained wing of the Republican Party had completely given way to the liberal internationalist wing of the Republican Party, who said, that the United States entry into the war, fighting the war, was absolutely necessary to save a world order, to protect Europe from fascism and Asia from militarism and so on. And that the mistake the lesson we should learn from the settlement of World War I, the Senate's refusal to ratify the Versailles Treaty, and for the United States declining to join, despite Woodrow Wilson's promise, declining to join the League of Nations, is that essentially you can't go home. Once you win one of these struggles, reverting to the status quo ante only leads to further conflict. So the lesson we have to learn is that the United States must remain in a leadership role, and in order to essentially secure the gains and the liberties won in the war. And the public, more or less, went along with that, believed that. And the people had to make a case, especially in this 1945 to 1950 period, where the public, the American people throughout history have tended to want to rapidly demobilize after a war. They want to bring the boys home. They want to get the troops out of uniform and back into the economy and working, and they want to spend less on the military and so on and so forth. And that was the same instinct, I think a sound, healthy instinct that the American people had after World War II, but the growing Cold War, the threat from Russia, was alarming elites, and the elites had to explain to the American people why what they wanted to do, however understandable, wasn't possible this time, that the United States was going to have to maintain this leadership position, spend more on the military than it was accustomed to doing in peacetime, keep the draft, which we never had done in peacetime, and so on. And they essentially, the elites, that is, the Truman administration and the D.C. elites and the foreign policy clerisy, as I sometimes call them, successfully persuaded the American people that this was necessary. And that's why you get, again, with ups and downs and bumps and some deviations, you get a fairly consistent bipartisan consensus for the 45 years of the Cold War.
Talking with Michael Anton. He is lecturer in politics at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C. He is your teacher for the new Hillsdale online course, American Foreign Policy. Find it at online.hillsdale.edu. There are two classes just on the Cold War years, and really a third when you get to kind of post-Cold War years. What was the effect of this bipolar international power structure on American foreign policy? How did the fact that it was really two great nations as opposed to many change the way Americans and American leaders looked at their foreign policy?
Well, I think perhaps even the greatest change was more domestic than foreign. It built up this giant federal security apparatus that's still with us today and is maybe even stronger than ever. The United States was famously, for being such an economically great power, was militarily weak for most of its history, in part because it just didn't need to maintain a large military in peacetime. And of course, the American founders warned. I mean, one of the things that they cited in fighting the Revolutionary War was the presence of standing armies was an affront to liberty. So the building of the security apparatus, the strengthening of the peacetime military, the creation of domestic civilian peacetime intelligence agencies, we had never had that before. The enormous nuclear weapons complex that was built up. The creation of the Air Force. And I don't want to go on and on and on, but these domestic things, I think, have actually almost had a greater long-term impact on the shape of the American regime and how it governs us than the foreign question. There is really no question in my mind, though, that the United States had to lead the free side of the Cold War. There just was no alternative. There was no one else able to do it. Other countries had either won the war and effectively all but bankrupted themselves in the course of winning the war, or had lost and were in economically terrible and physically terrible shape. So it was us or nobody, and we had to do it. The question that the course tries to raise, and at least in part answer, is, okay, once that was over, what was the proper stance for American foreign policy to take? And this was a big debate in the late 80s and especially into the early 90s. And there were two sides. One side said, okay, it's time to go back to what we were doing before, essentially minding our own business and letting the rest of the world take care of itself, intervening perhaps occasionally when necessary, but setting a very high standard for what is a required intervention. And another side said, look, we've won this incredible victory. We're in a position never seen before in the history of the world, or perhaps seen not since the preeminence of the Roman Empire. Why would we waste that position? Why would we squander it? Why wouldn't we instead try to maintain it for as long as possible? Obviously, the latter argument won the day. That's not to say that it's necessarily the stronger argument. It's just saying as a matter of historical practice, those are the people who won, and those are the policies we got, an attempt to maintain global preeminence. And I think one of the reasons why foreign policy is so acrimonious today and it's become such a problem in our politics is there's a sense in which elites in Washington, both career officials in government, but also the bipartisan establishment, are kind of trying to hang on to that position of preeminence by their fingernails, and it's slipping away. It couldn't have lasted. The world is, these other powers are going to rise one way or another. I mean, China is now, whatever you think of China, and I certainly have lots of skepticism and fears about China, but the United States can't maintain that 1989 position in the face of a rising China. Even Russia, is never going to be as great a power as China because it lacks the population, it lacks the economy, and so on. But it's still going to be with its territory, resources, population, nuclear arsenal, and so on. It's going to be a great power. Mm-hmm. We've got to learn to adjust and deal with that. And I think that this attempt to hang on to a fleeting moment of preeminence has hurt us much more than it has helped us.
There's a point that you make in a couple of places in this American foreign policy course, and that is that the people controlling foreign policy are people whose names that Americans would not know, who they never elected or voted for. How do we get in a position in which the people who are making decisions like the ones that you laid out are people who are so far removed from the American public?
It's very, very difficult. I mean, you'd have to elect a president who sees things differently. He'd have to be extremely careful and judicious in making his appointments. And, you need to get all of these people confirmed. And one of, to me, the disappointments of the Trump administration was how many positions were left unfilled and or were just filled by acting officials. And the acting, assistant secretary, acting this, acting that, they tend to come from the career ranks. So you're not getting any real change. But, that step one would be win an election, fill all of your 3,000 Schedule C appointments throughout the government. Obviously, many of those are not foreign policy positions, but many are. And then, we're going to have to get creative and work on some reforms that takes power away from the permanent state and returns power to the political branches, both in terms of people who are appointed and confirmed by the Senate, which is where this power ought to reside if the country is going to claim itself to be a democratic republic.
One final question for Michael Anton, who is your teacher for American Foreign Policy, the online course at online.hillsdale.edu. These are things you consider and things you think about, and I don't need you to necessarily go into a lengthy answer, but when you look at China, you mentioned previously in the rise of China, when you look at Russia, Ukraine, when you look at North Korea, where should the focus of American foreign policy be, or is it too external and not internal enough at this point?
I think that America's most pressing problems are by far internal and domestic and not foreign. And I sometimes fear or wonder if the United States leaders choose to focus on overseas challenges as a way of avoiding or ignoring or just hiding burying their head in the sand about very, very pressing domestic problems. I perhaps, could be proved wrong in what I'm about to say. I doubt it. But I just don't see any great pressing threats, external threats bearing down on America from the outside. We have a number of core interests that we are at 330 million people and whatever the GDP is now, 21 trillion or something, are absolutely capable of securing our core national interests without overextending ourselves to the extent that we overextend ourselves militarily, diplomatically, and to some extent economically. So I would, if I could wave a magic wand, I would refocus most of American political activity on the domestic stuff and just take care of our core interests overseas. And that does mean that a great deal of what we are doing now in the foreign realm, I think, is unnecessary and even wasteful.
Michael Anton, lecturer in politics and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C., also previously served in national security positions for President Trump and President George W. Bush. He is your teacher for American Foreign Policy, now available at online.hillsdale.edu. Michael, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, Graham Hillard joins us. He'll talk about his piece at the Washington Examiner, looking at the troubles inside NPR. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Over the past 100 years, America has pursued an ambitious foreign policy directed by faceless bureaucrats. While some of those departures were justified, American foreign policy is shifting. What began as the attempt of a free people to protect themselves has become rule by those who seek to impose their ideals around the globe. But how did we get here? In Hillsdale College's new free online course, American Foreign Policy, Michael Anton has the answers. Anton is a lecturer in politics at Hillsdale College, who served at the National Security Council during both the George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations, and he'll be your guide through the history of American foreign policy. Learn about the founders' vision of foreign policy and how progressivism and empire have eroded those principles. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out podcast.hillsdale.edu. You'll find older episodes of this program plus other great Hillsdale podcasts like The Larry Arnn Show, Hillsdale Dialogues, and Imprimis, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined now by Graham Hillard. He is editor at the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, a higher ed policy think tank in North Carolina, also contributing writer at the Washington Examiner, which is where we find this piece, Signal Failure. Left-leaning NPR deserves its comeuppance. You can find that at WashingtonExaminer.com. Graham, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Scott. Happy to be here.
The topic of NPR, its programming, its news stories, occasionally pops up in the news cycle. Why should we be paying attention to what NPR is doing? Why should we care?
Well, Scott, effectively, we have erected a taxpayer-funded monolith that ignores or distorts right-wing positions and airs left-wing positions uncritically every day, 365 days a year.
And about the taxpayer funding, how much actually ends up flowing through to NPR and NPR stations across the country?
You know, it's actually hard to put a precise dollar figure on it because, of course, the federal government funds the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which then funnels money to individual stations. But I can tell you that we're talking about tens of millions of dollars a year in funding. Of course, those who follow the federal budget know that tens of millions of dollars is a drop in the bucket. Nevertheless, this is real money that could go to something else and that on principle ought not to go to what is essentially partisan infotainment.
What about the audience itself, Graham? What is the kind of listener NPR is reaching? Do we know anything about the demographics?
There have been some surveys done of the average NPR audience. And as you can imagine, the average NPR listener is white, older than 44, somewhat or very liberal. NPR listeners tend to have top management positions, serve on local organizations. NPR is reaching a particular kind of niche audience. But I can tell you that NPR is suffering from a listener perspective, and that explains some of the budget cuts that we'll get around to here in a few minutes, I'm sure.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a moment. For people who are not listening to NPR, that might include a good portion of our audience today, you have taken the bullet for us, so to speak. You've listened to NPR. Tell us about their coverage, the kind of stories they cover, the kind of framing they put on these stories.
Oh, Scott, it is it's a disaster. And to everyone who has been driving around the Nashville, Tennessee area and seen me yelling at my radio or shaking my head, let me tell you, it's because I'm listening to NPR. Kind of a good hate listen every now and then. NPR is essentially indistinguishable from self-parody these days. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, every story was about race or gender. Now every story is about race, gender, or Ukraine. And when I say every story, I suppose I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you read my article, and I'm happy to go through some of the examples here, it really is astonishing the extent to which NPR can squeeze so much juice out of the beloved topics of racial discrimination, gender inequity, gender ideology, and of course now the war in Ukraine.
Well, you have these, what you call mockable categories of stories, the NPR stories that can fit into one of these, I think, 4 or 5 categories. Those might be interesting for our listeners to hear.
I give some examples here of stories in the last, at the time of this article's publication, which was a couple of months ago, in the last 30 days alone, NPR had done stories alleging, for example, racism in benefits decisions from the Department of Veterans Affairs, racism in the agricultural industry, in marijuana legalization fights, in what were then the Fed's anti-inflationary policies, Oscar voting. That was a big thing around the time that I was researching this story. And then you look back at some of the moments in which NPR has tried to, I joke that they're trying to combine their various race and gender enthusiasms. And so we get stories like students are resisting Black and LGBTQ erasure in one of California's whitest counties. Perhaps my favorite NPR story of all time, and favorite in scare quotes, of course, getting abortion pills into Ukraine during a war meant having to be creative. You really can't make this stuff up.
Graham Hillard is with us. This piece at the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. Left-leaning NPR deserved its comeuppance, which we'll get to in a moment. You write that NPR both drives and is driven by the aesthetic and ideological needs of a specific audience, that audience you described to us previously. Is it somewhat accurate for us to think about NPR as a publicly funded audio version of the New York Times in that way?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I compare it in my piece, or I should say I contrast it in my piece with the Sean Hannity show. I don't listen to the Sean Hannity show. I'm happy for the Sean Hannity show to exist. But the Sean Hannity show is self-sustaining in the sense that they sell ads. And if they stop selling ads and stop having sponsorships, and presumably it'll go off the air. Whereas NPR, certainly they have live reads. They have member funding. We've all listened to the hideously terrible week-long pledge drives, right? We all remember those. But if NPR ceased to get its funding elsewhere, it would still have the, you'll forgive me, the government teat to suckle on, right? And so very much, we're looking at a taxpayer-funded version of the New York Times, or really The Nation, or better still, The Daily Worker.
Graham, you write about some of the troubles that NPR now is finding itself in. Earlier this year, they eliminated some vacant positions. They won't fill those, and about a tenth of the current workforce at NPR was eliminated. What kind of trouble is NPR finding itself in 2023?
Yeah, and there was more than that as well. In November of 22, NPR implemented a hiring freeze, travel restrictions, a $20 million budget cut. I think that the main problem is that NPR has expanded too fast in its podcast division. And so if you really get into the weeds of NPR's offerings, you'll see really a ton of podcasts, each one of which with a individual production team, writing staff, hosts, and no one is listening to these podcasts. And so that's where the cuts primarily came. But of course, it's also true that it's just more expensive these days to run a news service. Taxpayer funding does exist, but it can't cover all of the bills. One imagines that in a recession, member donations tend to go down. It's just, I guess I would call it a structural problem with NPR's financing, or to use a word that I'm sure they love in other circumstances, a systemic problem with their funding.
Now, I'm certain that the taxpayer funds aren't being reduced in any way, shape, or form. So should we read into this that there is some sort of reaction from the donor side that is not quite as supportive of NPR as they might have been in the past?
Well, I certainly haven't come across any inkling that there is ideological dissatisfaction on the part of NPR's donors. I mean, I feel like they walk hand in hand and will continue to walk hand in hand into the sunset. However, I'm speculating here, and I should be very clear. This is mere speculation that, like all charitable organizations, NPR sees its donations go down a little bit during times of economic trouble, which of course we have been through, whether or not we're going to call it a recession.
Now, toward the end of the piece, Graham, you talk about this occasional effort from Republicans to defund NPR, to remove that taxpayer funding from NPR's budget each and every year. There are a lot of issues that the right could focus on in Washington. Why is defunding NPR something that should be perhaps higher on the priority list?
Well, I guess, will your audience be satisfied if I say because it annoys me the most? I think there's something to that. I mean, really, it is a symbolic thing. And obviously, if we are going to fix something of greater substance, if you offered me, paying off the national debt or defunding NPR, I would probably grit my teeth and choose the former. But it is, it sticks in the craw of the conservative or even centrist listener that his or her tax dollars are being funneled to a project that is increasingly, almost cartoonishly ridiculous. And I think that there's a place in our media landscape for public radio. But the fact that it is one-sided, the fact that it is demonizing one political group and presenting the other's talking points on a daily basis, it's a real problem, especially in a country that is as politically divided as ours. So it's something that I would love to see fixed. That said, it will never be defunded any more than we'll ever repeal Obamacare or kill Amtrak, as I write in my article. Republicans would far prefer to campaign on the issue. They want the issue, not the solution. So I think NPR is here to stay, and we'll all be writing our checks to it, or rather the government will be writing checks on our behalf for as long as we all continue to live and breathe, I'm afraid.
Graham Hillard, you can find this piece at WashingtonExaminer.com. Signal failure. Left-leaning NPR deserves its comeuppance. Graham is also editor at the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, which is a higher ed policy think tank in North Carolina. Graham, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks, Scott. My pleasure.
Up next, Christopher Busch from Hillsdale's English department joins us to begin a series of talks about the life and work of Robert Frost. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Available now, renowned psychologist Jordan Peterson joins Hillsdale College president Larry Arnn on the latest episode of The Larry Arnn Show.
Predict the future for me a little bit. It seems to me things are coming to a point. Do you think so?
Yeah, well, I think things have always been coming to a point, but they're coming to a point way faster. Well, we have Moore's Law, right? Computing power doubles every 18 months. It's like, no, you don't understand. Computing power doubles every 18 months. We're now at the point in the course of technological progress where those doublings are happening multiple times within the span of a single life. And that means the ancient archetypal battles are accelerating.
Listen to this exclusive interview with Jordan Peterson right now. Only available on The Larry Arnn Show. Find it on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. And subscribe to receive new episodes delivered right to your device. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. You can get an email every time there's a new episode of the show. Go to radiohour.hillsdale.edu and enter your email address. That's radiohour.hillsdale.edu. We're joined now by Christopher Busch. He is professor of English at Hillsdale College. Christopher, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning. Great to be with you, Scott.
Excited to begin a series on Robert Frost, the great poet. We start with a biographical look at Frost and his life and how he came to writing. For people who have an idea of the name, maybe not the works, what are some of Frost's most well-known works, and how would most people know about him?
Well, Scott, probably most people would have come to Robert Frost in elementary school or maybe even before that if their parents read to them. And probably Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening would be one that many would know. The Road Not Taken, Birches, The Gift Outright, which Frost recited from memory at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. So those would be some, I think, that most of your listeners would know about and would have read and heard.
We're going to get into his early life in a moment, but I want to ask you specifically, you're here talking about Robert Frost with me and our listeners. What is so interesting about Frost, his work that draws you to him?
Well, I think I probably came to Robert Frost in the way that most people do, and I always liked the way that he could be understood. And he said in an interview that he thought of himself as being in the school of poets who want to be understood. And so his language is very accessible. I happen to like his rural themes, and there's just something very American about him. So
let's head to his early days, his early life. What should we know about Robert Frost's early life that might allow us to understand him better?
Well, I think one of the surprises for many of us about Robert Frost is that we think of him as a New England poet, but he was born in San Francisco, which is
hard to get farther away.
Really, really surprising. And he lived there until he was about 10 or 11 years old. His father passed away from tuberculosis, and then his mother and Robert and his sister moved back to live with his paternal grandparents. The thing that's really important to know, I think, about Frost's early life is his mother's influence. His mother read aloud to him from a very early age. And she read, myths and fairy tales. She read from the Bible, but she also read Shakespeare and Poe and George MacDonald and Emerson and Robert Burns and others. And I think she really planted that love of sound and the love of literature and poetry, especially in him, from a very, very early age. And so I think that was a really big influence on him. She did a lot of teaching herself, and she was a teacher. He was one of her pupils. And when he went on to high school, he enrolled in a classical course of study, read Latin and Greek history and Roman history, some of the great literature. So I like to, emphasize that he had a classical education. And I think that really gave him a lot of rich background that then he could bring to his own poetry. He did a lot of things in his early life. He worked on a farm. He sold magazine subscriptions so he could buy a telescope. He learned how to play tennis, which becomes important later on in how he thought of his poetry. And he fell in love. He fell in love with Eleanor White and ended up marrying her later on after she finished college. She would not marry him until she had finished college. And that was a little bit of a sore point for him.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that in just a little bit, talking with Christopher Busch, professor of English here at Hillsdale, about Robert Frost and his life, a biographical sketch here as we begin a couple of conversations about Frost and his work. Looking at his approach to writing and his approach to poetry and his creation of what he would call the sound of sense in poems. What does that mean? How is he able to accomplish that?
Yes, well, there's some new research or fairly recent research that came out that I found to be very, very interesting and helpful. It's an essay written by a poet and an essayist, Dana Gioia, in 2013. And it's called Robert Frost and the Modern Narrative. And what he argues really is that Robert Frost, in creating what Dana Gioia calls conversational blank verse, really was doing something brand new. He says there is no exact precedent in English verse for Frost's dramatic narratives. And so what is the sound of sense? Well, the sound of sense basically is the tone of vernacular conversation. And so the way that it's described is that if you hear some voices, someone speaking, a couple of people speaking behind a door, and you're not able to make out the words, and you're not able to really hear what they're saying, but you can hear the intonation. You can hear the sound of the sentence. And so he called it the sound of sense or sentence sound. And what he really tried to do, he said, I'm doing something completely new here. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to capture that vernacular English, in fact, that kind of American vernacular English that he had heard, growing up, that he had heard among people that he worked with on farms and in mills and things like that. He wanted to capture that, and that was something that was new. Now, what's also interesting, what Professor Joya points out, is that he pairs that with the underlying traditional rhythms of poetry.
Robert Frost leaves America for England in 1912. While there, he publishes 2 books. Why did he leave? Why did he go? And why are those 2 books of significance for us?
Well, he had been writing poetry for probably all of his adult life. And then the problem that he was having is that he was not able to interest publishers in his work. And he was teaching, he was farming, he was married and having children, but he was really not going anywhere in his vocation. And so he went to England and spent about 3 years in England. Now, why England? Someone asked him one time, and he said, well, it was the land of the Golden Treasury. And the Golden Treasury was a book, a collection of poetry that he had bought when he was about 18 years old. And it captivated him. And so he said, I want to go to England. And the thing that was amazing was he went to England, and within a very short time, he had written most of the first 3 books that he would publish already before he even got to England. So he put together his first book, which is called A Boy's Will, and he submitted that to a publisher, and it was accepted. His second book, called North of Boston, came out a year or 2 later. And when he returned to the U.S. after that, he was famous. And so it's really it's a remarkable story.
You told us earlier about his loss, the loss throughout his life. He lost his father as a child, his mother as a young adult, 4 of his 6 children. How did he handle those tragedies in his life? Does he address them in his work either directly or indirectly?
Well, I think in his life, I think he was extraordinarily involved, despite a very, very active, writing program that he did in writing his books and his poems and lecturing widely. But through all of that, he was faced again and again with tragedy, and the tragedies that he faced were, the death, as you said, of his father, of his mother. Later on, his wife passed away as well. His children, died. His daughter Marjorie died shortly after giving birth. His son Carol committed suicide, and there were problems that he had to institutionalize his sister and one of his daughters. And so I think the thing that's amazing is how involved he was in their lives and what a role he played in trying to address the struggles that they were going through. And in his poetry, I think he probably does address some of that. For example, he and his wife Eleanor lost a child to cholera early on, and he wrote a poem called Home Burial, which is a great early example of this new Sound of Sense, this poetic conversational narrative that he puts forward. And it really is a conversation between a man and his wife who have lost a child, and it really develops that kind of the conflict between them and the way that they're trying to work through it in their individual ways. So I think that's very, very powerful. The other poem I think that where he addresses something of that is probably Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, where he says, I really would kind of like to just stay here in the woods, but I have promises to keep. As I said, he's very, very devoted to his children, to his family. But I think, at that point, he's really weathered quite a lot and would just like to perhaps just stay there in the woods.
talking with Dr. Christopher Busch about Robert Frost. Oftentimes the creatives, artists, writers, we hear the stories of them going through life penniless, and after they die, all of a sudden acclaim and honor. And Frost is very much the opposite. Frost is the recipient of 4 Pulitzer Prizes, praised by his contemporaries while he was alive. How did he handle that success?
I think generally he loved it. I think he had spent all those early years kind of in anonymity, more or less, in the kind of the poetic desert. And so then coming back to America after publishing the first 2 books of poetry, he is probably one of the poets who spent the most time in universities in teaching, at the University of Michigan and at Amherst College in particular. But he had residencies, and he was one of the founders of the Bread Loaf writing program, which has been profoundly influential. So I think he loved to speak. He loved to read his poems. It seemed that he loved teaching. So I think he handled that very, very well. And then, of course, later on in his life, he became a bit more well-known and suppose you could say politically involved. And so I think he really enjoyed it.
The epitaph on Robert Frost's grave reads, "I had a lover's quarrel with the world." How would you explain the meaning of that statement?
It strikes me that it's just a perfect description of who Frost was. He loved the world, but he wrestled with it. A lover's quarrel with the world. In his poem Birches, he says, "Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better." But then he says it's also a very difficult place and a painful place. And I think that wrestling with it, that struggling with it, is really what his poems are so often about.
Dr. Christopher Busch, professor of English here at Hillsdale College, as we begin our series on the poetry of Robert Frost and the works of Robert Frost with a biographical look at his life. Dr. Busch, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Michael Anton, your teacher for the new Hillsdale free online course, American Foreign Policy. Graham Hillard, who wrote in the Washington Examiner about NPR's struggles, and Chris Busch from Hillsdale's English department. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.